Okay, the first slide that, most of all, I'm not going to stop to talk about the specific slides, but the first one that was, the previous slide was Gertrude Stein, the cover of one of her many notebooks. And I just love it because I'm running bird imagery through a lot of this talk. It's just a standard French Carnet school notebook. And she had 3 or 4 of them, which she wrote just sentences into. She started at the beginning and she just obsessively did nothing but sentences for 3 that didn't, just sentences. And later on I'll be reading a couple of them. So, okay, here we go. For this lecture, I've combined images from research libraries, as Michael said, and special collections with my spoken written text without supplying a narrative logic or stopping to identify each one, thus allowing you to make your own connections. From start to finish in my poetry and criticism, the porous border between visual and verbal, sound and sight has always been a primary concern, as it is in the work of poets and authors whose manuscripts, drafts, and doodles you will see here. I won't stop either to identify many of the passages I read aloud, but I think that I make it clear in the reading. Okay, I believe that electronic technologies, as they evolve, are radically transforming the way we read, write, and remember. The nature of archival research is in flux, the primary difference being our way of viewing and touching objects and documents, as opposed to merely viewing the same material on a monitor. Databases, computer-generated searches, the study of literature as a system, the recovery of keywords and related projects. It's a brave, new, and fascinating technological world. While I realize that profound changes have occurred and are continuing to provide myriad possibilities for artists, poets, academics, autodidacts, and poets, in terms of storage, access, and research, this lecture is a collaged swan song to the old ways. I'm going to begin by reading from the 3rd section of William Carlos Williams' Patterson, The Library. A cool of books will sometimes lead the mind to libraries of a hot afternoon, if books can be found cool to the sense to lead the mind away. For there is a wind or ghost of a wind in all books, echoing the life there, a high wind that fills the tubes of the ear until we think we hear a wind actual to lead the mind away. Drawn from the streets, we break off our mind's seclusion and are taken up by the book's winds, seeking, seeking, seeking down the wind until we are unaware which is the wind and which the wind's power over us to lead the mind away. And there grows in the mind a scent, it may be, of locust blossoms, whose perfume itself is a wind moving to lead the mind away, through which, below the cataract, soon to be dry, the river whirls and eddies. First recollected, spent from wandering the useless streets these months, faces folded against him like clover at nightfall, something has brought him back to his own mind, in which a falls unseen tumbles and rights itself and refalls and does not cease falling and refalling with a roar, a reverberation, not of the falls, but of its rumor unabated. Beautiful thing, my dove, unable, and all who are wind-blown, touched by the fire and unable. a roar that soundless drowns the sense with its reiteration, unwilling to lie in its bed and sleep and sleep, sleep in its dark bed. In his legendary The H.D. book, a collection of essays, chapters, and meditations inspired by the life and writing of the poet Hilda Doolittle, that until 2011 only existed in photocopies and separate chapters in out-of-print little magazines or on hard-to-locate internet sites, the poet Robert Duncan writes, "The secret of the poetic art lies in the keeping of time. To keep time, designing or discovering lines of melodic coherence, counting the measures, marking them off, calculating sequences, the whole intensified in the poet's sense of its limitation. One image may recall another, finding depth in the resounding." Duncan also speaks of the romantic spirit, and back of that, the spirit of romance under boycott. He wrote this in 1961. The taboo is even more severe now. But I believe this currently exiled spirit, Keats's beauty is truth, truth beauty. Wallace Stevens' the giant body, the meaning of its folds, the weaving and the crinkling and the vex. Williams' beautiful thing, a flame. And beauty is a defiance of authority. This visionary spirit, a deposit from a future yet to come, is gathered and guarded in the domain of research libraries and special collections. On June 20th, 1926, Hart Crane, then staying on his mother's family property on the Isle of Pines, Cuba, wrote to Waldo Frank while working on what he hoped would be his epic poem, The Bridge. Quote, "The form of my poem rises out of the past that so overwhelms the present with its worth and vision that I'm at a loss to explain my delusion that there exist any real links between that past and a future destiny worthy of it. The destiny is long since completed. Perhaps the little last section of my poem is a hangover echo of it, but it hangs suspended somewhere in ether like an Absalom by his hair." That line is what makes Hart Crane such a great writer. Possibly during 1885, the year before she died, Emily Dickinson wrote in a letter to his sister-in-law, Susan, "Emerging from an abyss and re-entering it, that is life, is it not, dear? The tie between us is very fine, but a hair never dissolves." Things in themselves and things as they are for us. Often by chance, via out-of-the-way card catalogs or through previous web surfing, a particular deep text or a simple object, bobbin, sampler, scrap of lace, reveals itself here at the surface of the visible by mystic documentary telepathy. Quickly, precariously, coming as it does from an opposite direction. If you are lucky, you may experience a moment before. The English word text comes from medieval Latin textus, style or texture of a work, literally thing woven, from the past participle stem of textere, to weave, to join, fit together, construct. In several notebooks, she labeled sentences, 1928 through 1929. Gertrude Stein writes, and these are some of these incredible sentences, "A sentence is an imagined masterpiece. A sentence is an imagined frontispiece. What is the difference between a sentence and a sewn? What is the difference between a sentence and a picture? They will sew, which will make it a tapestry. A sentence is not carrying it away. A sentence furnishes while they will draw. A sentence is drawers and drawers full of drawings. In looking up from her embroidery, she looks up at me. She lifts the tapestry. This is my favorite. It is partly. Think in stitches. Think in settlements. Think in willows. An article by Edward Moore and Arthur Burks on editing the manuscripts of the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce has an epigraph taken from the horse's mouth. I am a mere table of contents, a very snarl of twine. In research libraries and collections, we may capture the portrait of history in so-called insignificant visual and verbal textualities and textiles, in material details, in twill fabrics, beadwork pieces, pricked patterns, tiny spangles, sharp-toothed stencil wheels, in quotations, thought fragments, rebuses, rhymes, syllables, graphemes, endangered phonemes, in soils and crossouts. In 1907, Henry James placed his second novel, Roderick Hudson, first in the 24-volume Scribner's New York collection of his novels, novellas, and short stories. Near the beginning of the preface he wrote for the edition, he asks, "Where, for the complete expression of one's subject, does a particular relation stop giving way to some other not concerned in that expression? Really, universally, relations stop nowhere. And the exquisite problem of the artist is eternally but to draw, by geometry of his own, the circle within which they shall happily appear to do so." All of which will perhaps pass but for a super-subtle way of pointing the plain moral, that a young embroiderer of the canvas of life soon began to work in terror, fairly, of the vast expanse of that surface, of the boundless number of its distinct perforations of the needle, and of the tendency inherent in his many-colored flowers and figures to cover and consume as many as possible of the little holes. The development of the flower of the figure involved thus an immense counting of holes and a careful selection among them. That would have been, it seemed to him, a brave enough process, were it not for the very nature of the holes, so to invite, to solicit, to persuade, to practice positively 1,000 lures and deceits. One historical existential trace has been hunted, captured, guarded, preserved in aversion to waste by an avid collector, then shut carefully away outside an economy of use, inaccessible to touch. Now it is reanimated, recollected, recollected through an encounter with the mind of a common reader, a researcher, an antiquarian, a bibliomaniac, a sub-librarian, a poet. Each collected object or manuscript is a pre-articulate empty theater where a thought may surprise itself at the instant of seeing, where a thought may hear itself see. For conversion, there must be a mysterious leap of love. Sometimes a hidden verso side acts as prior counterpoint, the way improvised children's tales have needlepoint roots in Latin holy words and medieval jargon. What difference does it make if what we see before our mind's eye has already been interpreted? This meanly magnificent waste exists on a scale beyond actual use. It provides us with a literal and mythical sense of life hereafter. Coming home to poetry, You permit yourself liberties. In the first place, happiness. On August 9th, 1926, Hart Crane ended a letter to Waldo Frank this way: I've never been able to live completely in my work before. Now it is to learn a great deal, to handle the beautiful skeins of this myth of America, to realize suddenly, as I seem to, how much of the past is living under only slightly altered forms, even in machinery and such like, is extremely exciting. So I'm having the time of my life, just now, anyway. My 1971 edition of Noah Webster's Third International Dictionary defines skein, a knot or number of knots of thread, silk, or yarn, a loosely coiled length of yarn or thread, wound in a reel suitable for a process as dyeing or for sale as knitting wool or embroidery. Something suggesting the twistings and contradictions of a skein unraveled the tangled skein of evidence. A trimmed strip of osier made from splits for basket work. A metal thimble on an axletree arm. That sounds like a Gertrude Stein sentence. A flock of wildfowl in flight. Words are skeins, meteors, mimetic spirit sparks. Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, first published in 1828, is repeatedly invoked by our 19th century North American interpreters, Emerson, Melville, Hawthorne, Dickinson, Whitman, and many others. Often his definitions read like blank verse. Edward Dickinson, that's Emily's father, Edward Dickinson's copy of the first edition was in the family library, and Emily Dickinson herself owned an 1844 reprint of the 1841 edition. Noah Webster, with her grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was one of the founders of Amherst College, and her father was on the board of the Amherst Academy, the coeducational primary school she attended, and where for a time Webster served as president pro tem of the school board. In 1862, she told Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "When a little girl, I had a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned. Soon after my tutor died, and for several years my lexicon was my only companion." Noah Webster, stitch, verb transitive. 1. To sew with the back puncture of the needle so as to double the thread, as to stitch a waistband. To sew or unite together, as to stitch the leaves of a book and form a pamphlet. 2. To form land into ridges, New England. To stitch up, to mend or unite with the needle and thread, as to stitch up a rent, to stitch up an artery. Running over affinities and relations, as was her practice, Dickinson could discover on the previous STI page of her lexicon companion the definition for STICH, pronounced stick. Noun. 1. In poetry, a verse of whatever measure or number of feet, stick is used in numbering the books of Scripture. 2. In rural affairs, an order or rank of trees. In New England, as much land as lies between double furrows is called stick or a land. Or she could skip down a few words on the same page to stickomancy, the divination of lines or passages of books taken at hazard. After Dickinson's death, this note was found among her papers. What a hazard an accent is. When I think of the hearts it is scuttled or sunk, I almost fear to lift my hand to as much as a punctuation. Quotations are lines or passages seized at hazard from piled up cultural treasures. A quotation exerts a finite, particular inflection in advance. cut or closely teased out, as with a needle, it can interrupt the continuous flow of a poem, a tapestry, a picture, an essay, or a lecture like this one. Stitch, noun, a single pass of a needle in sewing. The search is a poet for his language to collate with the language of the noise of the falls, which seems in itself to be a language which we were and are still seeking. That's William Carlos Williams. Between 1946 and 1958, William Carlos Williams labored over the work he conceived as a, quote, long poem in 4 parts. He eventually completed 5, and at the end of his life had started on a 6th. The 5 were published by New Directions in separate limited editions. My favorite, Book 3, The Library, 1949. He later said that in Patterson, he wanted to use the, quote, multiple facets which a city presented as representatives for comparable facets of contemporary thought, thus to be able to objectify the man himself as we know him and love him and hate him. I deliberately selected Patterson as my reality, unquote. I don't know how many of you know that William Carlos Williams was Robert Smithson's pediatrician and also had a big influence on him. Once he had fixed on the city, he needed to gather and collect facts in relation to the place, especially to the Passaic River and its falls, from libraries, local and otherwise. Wallace Stevens began his preface to Williams' collected poems, 1921 through 1931, this way. There are so many things to say about him. The first is that he is a romantic poet. This will horrify him. And the preface did annoy Williams, to say the very least. Yet the proof, says Stevens, is everywhere. In Rubbings of Reality in the Briarcliff Quarterly, 1946, Stevens added, Williams is a writer to whom writing is the grinding of a glass, the polishing of a lens, by which means of which he hopes to be able to see clearly. His delineations are trials. They are rubbings of reality. The German pietists of the early 1700s who came to Pennsylvania to live in the caves of the Wessahickon and to dwell in solitude and meditation were proceeding in their way from the chromatic to the clear. Is not Williams, in a sense, a literary pietist, chastening himself incessantly along the Passaic? Unquote. Rigor of beauty is the quest, is the first sentence of the preface to Patterson, Book 1. This romantic literary pietist, named for his city, must unravel the skeins of evidence in order to find beauty locked in the mind. The quest leads him to the library. Here Patterson the poet rifles through old newspapers and local histories with their genteel accounts of community celebrations, picnics, suicides, politics, extracts from popular and scientific thinking. Slang, sense observations, analogies, intensely lyrical passages, a concatenation of contrasting vibratory forces. Rhetoric balances the scale of law and magic with spontaneous particulars of sound. Reading Patterson reminds me of walking barefoot across a small strip of common land near my house that's littered with beach glass, broken oyster shells, razor clams, and kelp. It's called a beach, but no one swims there because even at high tide, what is euphemistically referred to as sand too quickly becomes marl, mud, and marsh grass. I feel the past vividly here. My own memories and the deeper past I like to explore in poems. As I look across Long Island Sound, I can imagine it as open ocean, oh, thalassa, the lash and hiss of water, the sea, how near it was to them, soon, too soon. That's from Patterson. In 2015, Guilford is almost a suburb. The other day, driving home from New Haven, listening to NPR in the car radio, I heard suburbs described as places successful people flee from now, so increasingly only the poor and the old are left. At the end of Book 3, the wadded library, once Patterson's hoped-for sanctuary, is muffled and dead. It disappoints. Are libraries suburbs? For many years, I taught and lived in Buffalo, another hard-up provincial northeastern or easternmost Midwestern Rust Belt city, with a crueler Niagara River and its larger, more dramatic falls. But it wasn't until I recently returned to give a reading that I actually visited the original documents that went into forming Book 3, now housed in the University Library's poetry collection. Here I encountered the actual preliminary rubbings of reality, typed and retyped drafts and collected newspaper clippings Dr. Williams used as fuel for the fire of poetic artifice. Whirling flames leaping from house to house, building to building, carried by the wind. The library is in their path. Beautiful thing, a flame. A defiance of authority burnt Sappho's poems, burned by intention, or are they still hid in the Vatican crypts? Beauty is a defiance of authority, for they were unwrapped fragment by fragment from outer mummy cases of papier-mâché inside Egyptian sarcophagi. Niagara Falls and the Great Falls of the Passaic River. Names are supposed to be signs for things. But what if things are actually the signs of names? What if words possess a spirit potential to their nature as words? Then things of experience in their passage between languages might materialize into posthumous vowel notes whipped up with shifting consonantal impact until, by a sidestep or little jump, the embroidered manifestation of an earlier vernacular reflects authority, Edenic justice, through ciphered wilderness and pang. Poet, are you there? Prescription, prefatory writing, order, rule. The establishment of a claim of title to something under common law by virtue of immemorial use. A written direction for the preparation, compounding, and administration of a medicine. Name, age, address, date, telephone. When we were children, playing games of hide and seek, the person chosen to be it, now turned round, alone and counting, was supposed to keep looking, in spite of snares and false resemblances. Ask the librarian behind the desk for a cardboard box of labeled file folders containing singular, whispering skeletons. Place one in my looking glass hands. As such, the sweet white locust tree at heavy cost. This consecrated branch transmits to posterity the benefits of seeds or buds hidden in trees for thousands of years. Now, this is manuscript. I'm now lurching into Jonathan Edwards, who was, well, I'll tell you, but anyway, I was simply amazed when I saw this cover to his book, one of his many, many millions of manuscript books, but that it said faith, faith, because Nathaniel Hawthorne, in his absolutely wonderful story, Young Goodman Brown, I mean, he'd never seen this, but this is kind of the mindset that continues down, has this sort of climactic line. His wife's name is Faith. Faith, shouted Goodman Brown in a voice of agony and desperation, and the voices of the forest mocked him, crying, Faith, Faith, as if bewildered wretches were seeking her all through the wilderness. Previous work I've done in terms of manuscript and archives led me to the massive collection of the papers of the 18th century New England theologian, some say our first American philosopher, Jonathan Edwards, in New Haven at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. The Beinecke was constructed from Vermont marble and granite, bronze and glass during the early 1960s. The structure displays and contains acquisitive violence, the rapacious fetching involved in collecting. On the other hand, it radiates a sense of peace. Downstairs in the modernist reading room, I hear the purr of the air filtration system, the rippling sound of pages turning, singular out-of-tune melodies of computers rebooting. Scholars are seated at wide work tables bent in devotion over some particular material object. They could be copying out a manuscript or deciphering a pattern. Here is deep memory's lure and sheltering. In this room, I experience enduring relations and connections between what was and what is. Beinecke's vast collection of Edwards family memorabilia contains letters, diaries, notebooks, essays, and more than 1,200 sermons, most of them in minuscule print. I can't believe how small the print is. Anyway, Jonathan Edwards was the only son among 10 unusually tall sisters. Their minister father jokingly referred to as his 60 feet of daughters. Their mother, Esther Stoddard Edwards, also known for her height, taught her 11 children and others in Northampton in a school that consisted of a downstairs room in their farmhouse. Later, they received the same education Timothy provided to local boys in his parish in East Windsor, Connecticut. The girls were tutored along with their brother. In some cases, they tutored him in theology, philosophy, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, history, grammar, and mathematics. They attended finishing school in Boston. But almost all that remains from this 18th century family's impressive tradition of female learning are a bed sheet, probably woven by his mother, a tiny blue fragment of his wife Sarah Pierpont Edwards' wedding dress, a journal kept by Esther Edwards Burr, Jonathan and Sarah's oldest daughter, and several raggedy scraps from his younger sister Hannah's private writings. I remember the summer before my sister Jerusha's death, and I was leaning over the south fence and thinking in this manner, that I was never likely to do better, and where should I go, etc. The folio-sized double leaves Jonathan, Sarah, and his 10 tall sisters wrote on were often homemade, hand-stitched from linen rags salvaged from worn-out clothing, sometimes on scraps left over from dress patterns. Lists, sermons, quotations of psalms, dissonant scripture clusters are pressed between coarse cardboard covers with frayed edges. The rag paper color has grown deeper and richer in some. Wrote the Romans, and the Romans, on the other hand, world. I used to felt soft, or in a sort, hardly knew who or what I was, and thereby the music and therefore lost I was. Consulted with myself about it, and and was ready. Harmony continues to exist through fact and experience, though there is no reason why it should. Nor is there any proof you can read back to the notion of one mind's inner relation with nature's vibratory hum. Lyric poets can't move heaven and earth in order to say things language separates from music through yearning, muted, rhythmic pulse, through stepwise voice motion. 3 of Edwards' manuscripts books I particularly love are titled Efficacious Grace. 2 of them he constructed from discarded semicircular pieces of silk paper his wife and daughters used for making fans. If you open these small oval volumes and just look without trying to decipher the minister's spidery script, pen strokes begin to resemble textile thread text. Surface and meaning cooperate to keep alive in one process, mastery in service, service in mastery. Sheer verbal artistry can be a force for mercy. I've always been drawn to Edwards, even his fire-eating sermons where each judging word has its particular cell, especially the notorious Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, a sermon preached at Enfield, July 8th, 1741, at a time of great awakenings, with its chilling epigraph from Deuteronomy 32. Their foot shall slide in due time. Because he understands the way in which single words and sentence clusters directly affect involuntary memory. Involuntary memory is lucid, preverbal, soothing. Hit or miss, an arrow into the eye of loving. One day by chance, I opened a folder titled Wetmore Hannah Edwards' Diary in the hand of her daughter, Lucy Wetmore Whittlesey. Inside was a copy of the private writings of Jonathan's sister. Lucy's late 18th century italic script, much easier to read than her uncle and her mother's earlier handwriting, begins in media res with an excerpt from Psalm 55:6. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. The visual and acoustic shock of that first exclamatory "oh" on paper brown with age made me think, because I'm not in a rush, of Henry James's great novel, The Wings of the Dove, and the beauty of the King James Version of the 55th Psalm in relation to its wide use in this novel, where James so perfectly finds his form for work that will follow. The fictional orphaned American heiress, Millie Teal, quote, stricken and doomed, condemned to die under short respite, while also enamored of the world, unquote, is based on James's American cousin, Minnie Temple, whose early death he feeds on as an artist. In 1914, at the end of his long writing career, James closed the second volume of his memoirs, Notes of a Son and Brother. William had died in 1910, with a chapter built around extracts from letters Minnie had written to their mutual friend, John Chipman Gray, shortly before her death, 44 years earlier. Chapter 13 ends with this paragraph. Death at the last was dreadful to her. She would have given anything to live. And the image of this, which was to remain long with me, appeared so of the essence of tragedy that I was in the far-off aftertime to seek to lay the ghost by wrapping it, a particular occasion aiding in the beauty and dignity of art. Did you put water up here? No. I don't see. Anyway, I'll try to stop choking. But, oh, there. I never have to do that. Anyway, Death at the last was dreadful to her. She would have given anything to live, and the image of this, which was to remain long with me, appeared so of the essence of tragedy that I was in the far-off aftertime to seek to lay the ghost by wrapping it, a particular occasion aiding, in the beauty and dignity of art. I mean, Wings of the Dove, if you haven't read it. That's where he wrapped it. Much as this cherished companion's presence among us had represented for William and myself, and it is on his behalf I especially speak, her death made a mark that must stand here for a too-awaiting conclusion. We felt it together as the end of our youth. Psalm 68:13. The wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions of fine gold. James heavily doctored the originals Gray had provided. Then he destroyed them. He also left out the extraordinary letters she sent both to himself and to William, the brother he said he was speaking for. Before sending Minnie's correspondence across the ocean, William James's widow, Alice Howe Gibbons James, and their daughter, Mary Margaret, carefully transcribed the originals in longhand. At some point, these copies were deposited in 4 folders at Houghton Library, where Habiter discovered them during the 1980s while he was working on The Father, A Life of Henry James, Sr. M. Temple, present as absent. The imaginary friend, known to be imaginary, but impossible to let go. Her initials play their part as reflectors in the wings of the dove. 5 years later, in the question of our speech, an address to the graduating class at Bryn Mawr College, Henry James told the assembled audience, "All our employment of constituted sounds, syllables, sentences comes back to the way we say a thing, and it is very largely by saying all the while that we live and play our parts," unquote. Then how do I pronounce the last name of this fictive figure in the gilded coach as she comes forth? A teal is a small, wild, freshwater fowl. Its flesh is food for hunters, but James has seeded the word with the spectral grapheme H, and the plant, wrapped in the dignity of art, has grown so that when I read THEALE on the page and say it aloud to myself, this aspirate puff of breath co-implicates his fictional birdwoman with wealth, theatricality, and death, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. THEALE reflects the orthography of John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, where frequent diagraphs EA and TH flourish as letter spirits. This is Keats. I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath, unquote. When I read Minnie Temple's letters, so artfully arranged to form the climax of Notes of a Son and Brother, the last letters of the orphan poet, also stricken and doomed, condemned to die under short respite, serve as images or shadows. Up from the mystic play of shadows, Walt Whitman, walking along Long Island's North Shore at Paumanok, listens to a migratory seabird pouring forth meanings in measureless measures. Whereunto answering the sea, delaying not, hurrying not, whispered me through the night, and very plainly before daybreak lisped to me the low and delicious word death, and again death, 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 death. THEALE leads to the limit of breath. The grapheme H breath's last letter remnant hangs suspended somewhere in ether like an Absalom by his hair. Alice James' copy of the last letter Minnie wrote to Gray on February 16, 1870, she died on March 8th, ends this way. I feel the greatest longing for summer or spring. I think I would like it to be always spring for the rest of my life, and to have all the people I care for me always with me, and never speak of going away. But who wouldn't like it so? Goodbye, write soon. I hope you are successful with your lectures. I should like to hear you give them. Are respectable spinsters allowed? Always affectionately yours, Mary Temple. Itself not so. The light is its judge's face, but not yet had the pin. John Chipman Gray and the Rule Against Perpetuities, 1886. In 1905, 2 years after finishing The Wings of the Dove, James returned to America after a 20-year absence. Recalling his visit in the American Scene, 1906, the section titled Cambridge and Harvard, he described catching sight of Gray. I went into the new law library, immense and supreme, in the shadow of which I caught myself sniffling the very dust, prehistoric but still pungent, of the old. I saw in the distance a distinguished friend all alone, belatedly working there. But to go to him, I should have had to cross the bridge that spans the gulf of time, and with the suspicion of weak places, I was nervous about its bearing me. Had the wings of a dove, but whither could I fly? Oh, and abiding portion, and no ring, deceiving enjoyment. Where shall I find real? I wander from mountain. Oh, that I could rest for the soul of them, and weary myself to. In research libraries and special collections, words and objects come into their own and have their place again. This known world, this exact moment, a little afterwards, not quite. Walking just below my father's orchard religion and the concerns of my soul, my business, religion, and the concerns of my soul, my business, strayed for and labored after an awakening sense of. Most of my writing life has been spent in Connecticut, not far from where Hannah Edwards Wetmore lived and wrote. Reading her private writings, I experience through an occult invocation of verbal links and forces the qualities peculiar to our seasonal changing light and color. It's a second kind of knowledge, tender, tangled, violent, august, and various. The as yet moon ran hang poised, rift air, nor had at the far reaches land and at or swim flew of things, Early November evening with frost forecast. The sight of a bare bough caught by streetlight outside my window, electric, false beauty and confined beauty, relict. Names shelter us under the wings of first creation. Hannah's first name begins and ends with the aspirate phoneme H, spectral letter H, occult, quick thought, reached through the fire of art. To reach is to touch. Poetry has no proof, nor plan, nor evidence by decree or in any other way. From somewhere in the twilight realm of sound, a spirit of belief flares up at the point where meaning stops and the unreality of what seems most real floods over us. The inward ardor I feel while working in research libraries is intuitive. It's a sense of self-identification and trust, or the granting of grace in an ordinary room in a secular time. Thanks.